New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the significance of Atlantis in the philosophical tradition. With me is philosopher Dr. Reza Jorjani, who is on the faculty at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He is also the author of Prometheus and Atlas, a book that won the 2016 Book Award from the Parapsychological Association. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you for inviting me, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure once again to be with you. Many people think of Atlantis as a myth. Some people think of it as history, but it actually has a deeper significance as well. It's part of our philosophical heritage, going all the way back to Plato.
Yes, it's remarkable that of all of the myths in human history, this is the one that philosophers who are developing a non-mythic way of thinking keep coming back to.
Mm-hmm. And Plato gave us some very vivid descriptions, not only of Atlantis, but of its importance in his own thinking.
The history of Western philosophy has often been described as a series of footnotes to Plato. And in fact, we get the most developed and first account of Atlantis from Plato. In his Timaeus and Critias dialogues, Plato recounts a lost civilization that flourished according to him, or rather reached its zenith, 9,000 years before his time. And he lays a great deal of emphasis on the fact that this is not a tall tale. Supposedly, he grew up in his family with an heirloom manuscript from Solon, the lawgiver of Athens. And Solon supposedly had received the story of Atlantis from priests in Egypt. And he was adapting it into a mythos that he hoped to have supplant the traditional mythology of the Greeks, the mythology set forth by Homer in, say, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yes. And Plato's notion is that this was once a very high civilization that was destroyed.
Yes, Plato actually describes this civilization as having been created through a hybridization of gods and mortals. At the beginning of time, the gods divided the earth into distinct regions, which each of them governed over, gods or goddesses. So that, for example, Athens is named after Athena, was the dominion of Athena. And Atlantis comes from the name Atlas. It means realm of Atlas. So Atlas was one of the sons of Poseidon. And it's interesting that in Greek mythology, Poseidon is often depicted as a rival of Zeus. So Atlas is the eldest son of Poseidon and the king of Atlantis. And in this civilization, over time, the blood of the gods is mixed with that of mortals. There's increasing hybridization to the point where these demigods essentially reject the Olympians as anyone worthy of reverence. They develop what you could describe as a humanistic civilization, self-confident and bent on dominion over the planet.
Well, you tell me what led to the destruction. I think it's unclear.
Well, this was viewed as a challenge to the power of Zeus. And so the Timaeus and Critias account of Atlantis ends with Zeus calling a convocation of the gods and determining that Atlantis be wiped off the face of the earth in a great deluge, which of course is a parallel to the Noah's flood story in the Bible.
So it's an instance in which Plato is very consciously drawing upon ancient Greek mythology.
Yes, and what's also very unique about it is this image of a global civilization, Atlantis was aspiring to unify all of humanity into a world order that no longer revered the gods, a world order where humanity was self-sufficient, as it were. And autonomous.
Well, Plato, in his Republic, developed his own model for what he thought the ideal society would be, ruled by philosopher kings. And I have to assume, maybe you can tell me, did he contrast this with the society of Atlantis?
Well, in fact, the dialogue Timaeus, which begins the story of Atlantis, picks up right where a Republic leaves off, and or the story unfolded between Timaeus and Critias. It supposedly takes place the day after Socrates and his associates have been sitting around discussing the utopian political system of Republic. So it's a direct continuation, and it begins with, I believe, one of Socrates' friends saying, "So the other day you painted a picture of the ideal regime for us. Now let's try to find something from actual history that is along those lines."
How does that evolve or unfold?
Well, the interesting thing is that Plato actually depicts the society of antediluvian or pre-flood Athens as something closest to the utopia of Republic. And the Atlanteans are supposedly invading the Mediterranean basin, and they wage a war against these Athenians. But so you would think that maybe he's intending to portray them as arrogant, people who are overtaken by hubris. But in fact, Zeus decides to drown the antediluvian Athenians along with them. So what kind of a just God is this? And what's the moral of the story, really?
Well, there are different versions that have been enunciated by different philosophers. I think in modern times, many people are even influenced by Manly Palmer Hall and in his notion that these people had incredible psychic powers that led to their own destruction, that they couldn't manage their technology. It's sort of almost a moral lesson.
Yes, Atlantis has been used to discuss both material advancements in technology, a kind of, from a material perspective, science-fictional society, and also to explore the idea of a society where psychic powers are prevalent. In particular, you see this respectively in the Atlantis stories of Sir Francis Bacon and then of Rudolf Steiner later. In Bacon's case, the New Atlantis, which he wrote in the early 1600s, is the first account of a science-fictional society with tremendous advances in technology that it's hard to fathom how Bacon was able to even conceive of in his time. Well,
Bacon was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and some people even think he was the author of the Shakespearean plays. Another thing about Bacon is that he's also regarded as one of the first philosophers to formulate the scientific method.
Right. And so one of the most interesting things about Bacon's Atlantis story is that although he uses the name Atlantis, this is not the same island continent that Plato was describing. Plato describes an island roughly the size of the continental United States. He says something the size of Libya and Asia combined, which for Greek geographers would have meant a landmass about the size of the continental United States. And this is described as being out beyond the Pillars of Hercules or the Straits of Gibraltar, somewhere in quote-unquote the world ocean. But Francis Bacon's Atlantis is an island in the Pacific Ocean. And some travelers have been stranded there by happenstance. And they discovered that this society, which is run by scientists and inventors, has isolated itself from the rest of the world. And it sends ambassadors to various countries and cultures to bring back all of the latest innovations in science and technology, where they're synthesized. And the governing body of this new Atlantis decides which of these can be safely incorporated into society and which other ones should be withheld until the time that people have ethically developed to a point where they're capable of making the best use out of them.
Well, it seems as if whereas Plato is presenting Atlantis as an actual historical event, Francis Bacon is really presenting it as a utopian scenario.
It does seem so. However, Francis Bacon was involved in some of the secret societies of his time,
Yes.
the so-called Invisible College, that was trying to extricate Europe from the mentality of the Middle Ages and often in occulted ways pursue scientific research. And in the New Atlantis, you very clearly see the idea of an Illuminati or a hidden scientific elite that has effectively developed a breakaway civilization, a very advanced civilization that's on the earth but concealed from other people, and a civilization that's waiting essentially for the rest of humanity to catch up with it ethically. So they send these ambassadors to various cultures, but under false flags and false names, as if they're diplomats from another nation. And they also bring back to the New Atlantis men of knowledge from India, Persia, Europe. So you have also a cosmopolitan civilization. They worship, or rather they set up statues of inventors and scientists rather than gods. This also tells you something about the mentality of the governing elite.
Well, it seems to be, in some sense, a reflection of Bacon's own personal world.
Yes, and it's amazing how he was able to extrapolate from the meager technical advancements of his time to things like submarines, telephone lines, skyscrapers, laser, sonic chambers. He describes the wise men or scientific researchers of Atlantis as masters of illusion who draw on all of these technical capabilities in order to be able to produce simulacra of reality. He's also got descriptions of robots in there and what appears to be genetic engineering of plants and animals.
It's almost as if Bacon was looking into the future.
It is almost.
One might say remote viewing the future.
Right, which brings us to Steiner, who explicitly claimed that his insights into Atlantis were based on the use of psi-ability.
Well, Rudolf Steiner is more known as a mystical teacher, a hierophant even, and a clairvoyant. And although he certainly was educated as a philosopher, I don't think he's regarded much in terms of academic philosophy at all.
Well, his early work was in academic philosophy. I believe his dissertation was on the subject of free will.
And Friedrich Nietzsche. Yeah.
And so Steiner's own proclivities are perhaps reflected in the way that he handles the story of Atlantis. He claims that the Atlantean civilization was founded by beings who descended to the earthly plane, but who were not entirely corporeal at the outset.
Consistent with theosophical teachings.
Yes. And they became teachers to a group of early human beings who wound up developing a society that inextricably intertwined what we would consider material advancements in technology with psychical abilities. So that on the one hand, you have some of the same technologies that Francis Bacon describes. But on the other hand, Steiner emphasizes that the mind interfaced with some of these devices. So that if we were in possession of some of the Atlantean pieces of technology, we probably wouldn't be able to make them work. Or at any rate, someone who wasn't an adept in psychokinesis wouldn't be able to make them work.
It reminds me of the movie Forbidden Planet, the old 1950s science fiction movie.
Actually, that's a very good comparison, because the way the story ends for Rudolf Steiner is that these Atlanteans turn their minds against one another. They begin to invade one another's minds with terrifying visions, and it turned their psychic abilities essentially into a weapon. This becomes the cause of the demise of the civilization. Although he also agrees with Plato that there was a great flood and earthquakes as the cause of Atlantis' destruction, he suggests that these alterations in the natural environment were brought about, again, by a misuse of psychic ability or psychokinetic ability.
Which is not so different from Plato's description of Zeus wreaking revenge.
Right. Right. And also, Plato's description of the way in which the demigods of Atlantis were beginning to use putatively divine powers for secular purposes that they ought not to have.
I suppose in a sense it's an echo of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel.
That's right. I think it is, very much so.
In a way, humans rising up to challenge the gods in one way or another.
Yeah, the most interesting element in Steiner's account is he suggests that at some point a cognitive change took place where we went from a mentality that was based largely on memory, where learning was a question of a vast store of experience, and the Atlanteans thought in terms of images. We transitioned from that into an analytical mode of thinking, and this destabilized the Atlantean society because only a few people made this transition at first. And then with their newfound analytical capabilities, they were in a position to manipulate the rest of society. And he actually traced the guru-worshipping cultures of India and the pharaoh-worshipping culture of Egypt to this transformation in Atlantean society.
I see. In other words, that the Atlanteans had godlike kings? Is that the notion?
A few of the people who developed a new form of thinking began to manipulate a society that was still largely linked together psychically through a collective consciousness. And he thinks this influenced Egypt and India because after the destruction of Atlantis, the Atlanteans went around and colonized various parts of the world, or perhaps relocated themselves to colonies that they had already established in various regions.
Well, there are some people who wonder about the fact that we have pyramids in Mesoamerica and pyramids in Egypt and other similarities, that there was once a global culture going back to prehistoric times.
Well, this brings us to the most recent of the philosophers who's made use of the idea of Atlantis in his work, and that's Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson synthesized all of the empirical research on Atlantis, or some such lost civilization of global scope. Some of the more interesting pieces of evidence that he drew together include the anomalies at the Giza site, where we have the Sphinx, the Sphinx temples, and the pyramids. And in particular, he looked at the work of Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, who determined that the weathering on the Sphinx is consistent with long periods of heavy rainfall. It has water erosion as well as wind erosion. This would push the Sphinx back in time to at least 7,000 BC. And this also means that the Sphinx and the Valley temples, which are built from out of the rock that was hewn out of the
carved
trench,
right into the limestone mountains.
Yes, well, so the Sphinx is carved out of a trench, and the rock that was loosed by that process was used to build those temples. So they must be contemporaneous with the Sphinx.
I see.
And their architectural style is very un-Egyptian. They're not covered with hieroglyphs, unlike most Egyptian temples. It's a very austere megalithic style, extremely high precision. The other thing that has been noticed about the Giza ground plan, particularly by the Belgian engineer Robert Beval, is that if you look at the three stars of Orion's belt, they're in the same pattern as the three pyramids at Giza, with the third one slightly misaligned from the first two. And the Sphinx has a counterpart among the constellations, namely Leo. And the Milky Way was viewed by the Egyptians as sort of a pathway to the heavens, means by which souls ascend and descend. Well, at a very specific time, dawn on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, the Sphinx is looking at the sun rising into the constellation of Leo. The Milky Way is mirrored on the ground by the Nile River, and the three stars of Orion's belt are in the same orientation to the Milky Way as the three pyramids are to the Nile.
All of which suggests that the date of construction might go back that far.
At the very least, the ground plan of the pyramids and the construction of the Sphinx and the temples there.
Because my understanding is that archaeologists don't date the pyramids as being that old.
Right. Well, the pyramids are built on limestone carved platforms, and all you'd need to get right were the platforms. Someone else could come and build the pyramids on top of them later, and you'd still have the same alignment.
I see.
So this date of 10,500 BC fits perfectly with Plato's dating of Atlantis, 9,000 years before his own time.
Yes.
And this isn't the only place we find these kinds of engineering anomalies. In Lebanon, at Baalbek, in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, there's a platform for the largest temple ever built by the Romans when they ruled that part of the world. They built a temple of Jupiter on a pre-existing platform, which consists of about 400-ton stones that are surmounted by 3 much larger stones, each weighing over 1,000 tons. They're referred to as the trilithons. And we know that these came from a quarry at a great distance because whoever the engineers were, they left one of these trilithon-sized blocks in the quarry, I think deliberately, to indicate that they had transported the stone over such a long distance.
Well, what you're suggesting is that there may actually have been a very advanced civilization that existed in prehistoric times that has influenced the evolution of philosophical thought subsequently.
Yes, and it's impacted subsequent human history. To give a very striking example, the Mayans believed that the builder gods who laid the groundwork for their civilization would someday return to them. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, or Viracocha, or Wotan, as he's sometimes referred to by the people in Mesoamerica and South America, had promised his children, as he called them, that he would return someday. And so when Cortez and the Spaniards showed up, they fit the physical description of the ancient builder gods and were received as such, so that it was very easy for them to proceed to plunder that civilization. But to focus on South America for a moment, I believe Polish archaeologist by the name of Arthur Posnanski studied the site at Tiwanaku for many years and determined that the precision with which that site is built, again in very much the same style as the Sphinx temples or as the Osirian and Abydos, which some people believe is covered by 8,000 years of sedimentation. This structure at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, its precision doesn't match its misalignment to, say, the solstices or the equinoxes. Stellar alignments were very important for these cultures. And so Posnanski corrected for the precession of the equinoxes, and he determined that that site was built sometime between 15,000 and 12,000 BC, which is interesting because the nearby port at Tiwanaku is now far above the water level. And what is suggested by the construction of a port at that location is that perhaps the engineers who put it there were dealing with a much higher sea level, perhaps a sea level that had precipitously risen, and they needed to rapidly construct a port.
Well, as a philosopher yourself, what do you think is the significance of all of these attempts by previous philosophers to make sense of this myth or legend or history?
Well, I think it has to do with Colin Wilson's ultimate conclusion in his study of Atlantis, and that's that the people, supposing the civilization existed, the people who were behind it had minds very different from our own. We're dealing with a type of human being that was still operating on something like animal instinct, a kind of society that functioned through an extraordinary intuition rather than through abstract conceptual thinking.
Although apparently they had high technology at the same time.
They had a very different form of technology. You know, we're at a loss as to how they moved these gigantic blocks, and especially with the precision that they did. Colin Wilson suggests that psychokinesis was involved. And this relates to what Steiner says about the Atlanteans, namely that they had a kind of collective consciousness, so that en masse, they were mesmerized in a way that made it easier, that facilitated these titanic tasks.
I see, through sort of a application of a group mind.
A mass PK effect, yeah.
What's the lesson for us today?
Well, since we are at this juncture that I refer to as the spectral revolution, where we're going to have to learn how to reorganize society in a way that it can support mainstream acknowledgement of psychic abilities. If in fact we had a civilization in the past that failed to grapple with the integration of these human capacities, perhaps we should look into it so that we can learn a lesson from it, so that the past doesn't repeat itself.
Well, I would imagine maybe at a subconscious level that's why there's so much resistance to parapsychology and 150 years of empirical evidence that is still sort of on the very fringes of academia and by many people, I think, regarded as a taboo topic. It might be some sort of subconscious fear of that we might repeat, or that people at a dim level remember some sort of destruction that was brought on by the misuse of such abilities.
I agree. I think we are haunted by the tragic fate of Atlantis on some deep level.
And there's also the possibility that somewhere, somehow, maybe in a different dimension, that the Atlanteans exist and are influencing us today.
Well, that takes us back to Francis Bacon's breakaway civilization. It might not literally be on the Earth. It might not be a concealed island on the Earth. Well, Jason Jorjani, this has been a stimulating conversation. It certainly raised many questions that we're not able to answer right now, but I trust that our viewers will be pondering for some time. Thank you so much for being with me. It was a pleasure being with you again, Jeffrey.
Likewise. And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.